you know, we have this fight at the founding about what the spending clause really means. Madison takes a fairly hard line that it's not a power unto and of itself, that it's only a general reference to the other enumerated powers. So spending for the common defense and the general welfare, you then had to point to one of the specific enumerations of power. And that's a view that has much to commend it. When you understand the dynamic of needing a stronger government, but also being very concerned about it being too powerful. And think we don't need to have a spending power for the common defense when there's a specific power to raise and support armies. I mean, those things seem to be exclusive. So Madison's argument seems to certainly be rational. But Hamilton's argument, much broader, it's not limited by these other enumerated powers. But even Hamilton, who was one of the broadest defenders of national power among the founding generation, said that whatever limits are in the spending power are contained in the clause itself. And that meant that the spending had to be for the general welfare and not for the local or regional welfare. Now, we've forgotten that. Our understanding of general welfare means anything that's going to be in the public benefit, however defined, is for the general welfare. But general was an adjective that had a specific meaning for them that we've lost. It meant national welfare, just like common defense, not for the local defense. And the notion that the federal government would pay for your local sheriff or your local police force rather than only the things for the common defense. The same distinction existed on the general welfare side. And so we've got some early examples of how this played out. There was one of the big industries of the day, the cod fisheries in New England were falling on hard times in the 1790s. And so in the early Congresses, there was a bill put in place to do a bailout of the cod fisheries industries, to provide a bounty for them to help get over the hard economic time that they were facing. And the bill ultimately passed, but only after it was clear that all we were doing was reimbursing them for an unconstitutional salt tax that had been collected. Other than that, the argument on the floor that prevailed in the House of Representatives that it was unconstitutional to have this bounty, that to take tax revenues from one portion of the country to support an industry in the other. It did not meet the requirement of the general welfare. Roads and other internal improvements all fell to the same constitutional challenge. And when the pressure to bring money back home became too great for Congress, the president stepped up, and in a series of very significant veto messages over the first half century of our nation's history, the presidents vetoed bills as unconstitutional. And the language that they used is, I think, descriptive of how we ought to be thinking about these questions. So here, President James Buchanan, probably not known to be one of our greatest presidents, but on this he was absolutely right. The representatives of the states and of the people, feeling a more immediate interest in obtaining money to lighten the burden of their constituents than for the promotion of the more distant objects entrusted to the federal government, will naturally incline to obtain means from the federal government for state purposes. And they'll do so at the disadvantage of the things that they're supposed to be funding, which is the things for the national purpose. They would harm the national interest in order to benefit their lone interest. And more importantly, if this view were to prevail, which he said it was human nature to do, it would operate equally to the detriment of the states, because it would remove the most wholesome of all restraints on legislative bodies, that of being obliged to raise money by taxation from their constituents. In other words, again, to tie the benefit to be given to the people that have to pay for it. And it would lead to extravagance, if not corruption. What is easily obtained and without responsibility will be lavishly expended, he said. Here's another one. This was in the floor of Congress, in the second Congress, and this is on the cod fisher bill. Establish a doctrine of bounties, Representative Giles said. Set aside that part of the Constitution which requires equal taxes and demands similar distributions. Destroy this barrier, and it is not a few fishermen that will enter, claiming $10,000 or $12,000, but all manner of persons, people of every trade and occupation, may enter in at the breach until they have eaten up the bread of our children. Oh boy, does that sound familiar lately. President Polk and his veto message of another massive spending bill. And by the way, this is one that actually had a hook in constitutional spending to provide some benefits to the Wisconsin territory, which, of course, is the responsibility of the federal government. But they took that small little $6,000 appropriation for the Wisconsin territory and added on about $500,000 in pork for other things that were not constitutional. And here's what Polk has to say. When the system of federal funding for internal improvements prevailed in the general government and was checked by President Jackson, it had begun to be considered the highest merit in a member of Congress to be able to procure appropriations of public money to be expended within his or her district, whatever might be the object. We should be blind to the experience of the past if we did not see abundant evidence that if this system of expenditures is to be indulged in, combinations of individual and local interests will be found strong enough to control legislation, absorb the revenues of the country, and plunge the government into a hopeless indebtedness. I think somewhere between the $500,000 there and the 12 trillion we're at now, we've probably crossed that threshold. So the question is there a way to get back to this? In Dole versus the Dole case, the court focused on the 4 criteria. It has to be within the general welfare. And then they completely punted any notion of adjudication on that question to complete deference to the legislature. And it's that piece I think needs to be fixed. If we understand that general meant national interest, it's a line that at the margins is going to be hard to draw, but much of what goes for federal spending today is not going to be close to that line. If I want to do a interstate highway system, that's national interest. If I want to run a spur off of that national highway system only to a particular local community, that's local interest. I mean, and that's an easy line to define. If I want to handle the ports and do a whole string of lighthouses along the coast that will benefit the entire coastal trade, national interest. If I want to take a non-navigable waterway between 2 points within a state and make it navigable within those same 2 points, local interest. Very easy. And it seems to me that that is at least as justiciable a question that ought to be decided by the courts as any of the other things the courts get into. And when you understand that what the founders tried to do here was put in place a check against this trend of democracies from voting themselves money out of the common purse. We've actually figured out a way to do this without even taking money from other people in the same room. We now take it from people 2, 3 generations hence. And, all right? That tendency of democracies can be checked only by a counter-majoritarian body, which the founders envisioned the judiciary to be. And I think it's a judicially enforceable line in many cases, if not all. And I think until we get to the position where we actually expect our courts to make those judgments, we're never going to put this genie of unfettered spending back into the bottle. Thanks.